saying it's so weird that like online strength training is like the only space in which if you say, hey coach, what am I doing wrong, saying you're not working hard enough is considered dodging the question.
But Menno Henselman is a perfect example of this. And
Why do you listen to me, you're killing yourself. Why do you look at so much of his stuff? And it's like if you're a guy who's getting after it, who draws more influence from academia, that's fine. But the requisite is that we're all guys who are getting after it. The other guy that like you could throw in there, not that his training is brilliant, but like Lane Norton, right?
oh yeah,
Big
yeah, yeah,
evidence
yeah,
based guy. He's
yeah.
getting after it. That guy trains really hard. So it's like
Yep.
I get
That's
what you mean, right? Which is like we're trying to have a discussion among people that take their training really seriously, not just a training among people that take reading literature really seriously. Now, if you're both, you got a place at the table. You got a good place at the table, right? Like Dr. Mike, I think is a phenomenal resource.
oh, of course, yeah.
But the discussion gets a little bit weird that don't train seriously. It's
Mhm.
it's almost like I
Very
talked
weird.
about the people that are like really new to it and they insist than them would get better results if they tried their paradigm shift. And it's like,
Mhm.
we've thought of this, we've tried this. I find that you get a lot of that from the evidence-based guys that don't train seriously. Is they say, oh, the evidence says this, all these strong guys would be better if they did X, Y, Z. And the strong guys are like, we've tried that. You know what I mean? Whereas if you've got a guy who does both, right? Like Faz Lifts, perfect example. I would say
Yep.
I'm very impressed by his videos. He's very clearly actually reading literature. And like, I feel like I've got a pretty good eye for the people that are like posing as evidence based, but they clearly don't put very much effort into keeping up with, like, they'll just read a study and make
Yep.
a video and they don't like, for someone whose whole identity is being like the science guy, wow, you really are behind the ball on
Yep.
trying to keep up with stuff. Like I'm not at the bleeding edge of this. I'm pretty casually into reading big meta-analyses when they come out and trying to keep a thumb on what the evidence-based like best practice is for sure. Uh, but wow, there's some guys that really just don't even read them. And like Baz Liv jumps out of me as a guy right away. I'm like, oh, you actually read shit. And you take your personal experience as someone who trains seriously and trains
Yes.
serious athletes and finds a middle ground and finds where, hey, maybe I'm going to err on the side of experience here. Very, very tasteful. I really like his videos.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't seen too many of them, but they're very well put together. He articulates the idea very well, and he sort of has like a nice take-home message for the audience to remember. It's like this might sound really important, but take this into consideration, right? It's like there's an emphasis on training wisdom at the end of the day, right?
Yep.
It's a wisdom-based
Yep.
thing, and you can't extract wisdom from a study. Like that's just something that science cannot, will not, in foreseeable future produce is wisdom, right? Like
Well,
it's yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
it's like kind of what we talked about earlier, which is like this idea, and I know it sounds cheesy, it's not lost on me, but this idea that training is just as much an art as it is a math equation,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
how you do the numbers, what it looks like feels like there's a very subjective thing that high level athletes have of how to get the most out of their training sessions. They understand, okay, I'm preparing for a strongman contest right now, but the objective of this training session, this is a higher emphasis than this. There's all of these things that don't really, you can't really concretely put them numerically, and you can't really concretely put them in a very scientific manner. It's a very subjective by feel component of high levels athletes training. I just calling it art because that sounds nice and
Sure, sure.
catchy. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
No, it's good.
and like you said, that a lot of that is training wisdom, right? That's something that you can't read a study and know how to get the most out of this. Like, let's say you come into the gym and you're having a trash session, you're really weak, right? How do you get the most out of it, right? And that's a very subjective thing that depends on what you're doing that day. It depends on what the objective of that specific training session is. Maybe we just do our top set and get the heavy touch and get out of there.
Yeah.
Maybe we do the opposite. Maybe we skip the top set and get in our volume based on that. That might be more conducive to the goal of this phase of training, right? And some of these things just come with wisdom, with practical experience of working with yourself or potentially working with other people can, I think, amplify the speed of that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, and this actually ties into the raging bull and the taming too, where it's like in order to be really like flexible and adaptive. You know, we talk about the body being adaptive, but your approach has to be adaptable, in my opinion, in order to sustain it long term. You've not skipped a training session, but I'm sure you've had things where, you know, and you've already discussed multiple examples where things needed to change along the way to push you in the direction where you wanted to go. And one of the things where you're in that scenario where it's a trash training session, like people who make good decisions not only are like, yeah, sure, being smart helps, being aggressive helps, but if you're someone who has a tendency to make good decisions to the point where we can stop saying you're not just getting lucky in the gym, you're actually putting good critical thought into this. It's logical, it's based on your training history, you can articulate the ideas even if it sounds a little pseudoscientific. You're basing this off of, you know, plenty of, let's call it evidence. If your own experience counts as evidence, right? I think it certainly does.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
you're making
yeah.
consistent good decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like what they showed us in school, right? Is like there's a hierarchy of evidence. Yeah,
Exactly.
like a really robust meta-analysis is a very high level of evidence. Anecdote is still evidence. It's a lower level of evidence, but when we lack a meta, like when there's like a really specific strength training question, you know, we don't have high level like strength training studies. We have very entry level stuff for the most part, right? So once we get past these entry level questions, we get into really niche stuff, right? We don't have these higher level of evidence. Oh, there's nothing up here. There's nothing here. We need to fall to anecdote or like kind of historical best practice or asking the guy that knows a lot that you respect his opinion. That is a level of evidence. Yeah, I could see the argument that if it's something that is fairly well researched, we might want to default to the higher level of evidence unless we really are observing to the opposite. Sure, I could see that. But to
Yes.
say that, yeah, to say that personal experience isn't a form of evidence is really weird, douchey, pretentious Instagram stuff.
Super, you know, speaking of Instagram, it's very, I agree, it's totally, it's disingenuous, comes off as douchey. I don't mean to like defame the guy at all, but Menno Henselmans is a perfect example of this. And
Why do you
you know, oh
listen to me?
man,
You're killing yourself. Why do you look at so much of his stuff?
I know. But like when he made that reel and he's like, yeah, well, this thing worked for me, bro. And it's like, well, how do you know that? And he's like totally discounting personal experience as if people who will rely on it can't articulate it in, you know, a couple paragraphs and make it really like concise, well-structured argument explaining what happened and why they perceived it to be that way, how that influenced their training or their clients, like as if it's just low IQ people that are like really dumb, like just throwing the weight around because I'm not scientific. Like that's how people often will talk down to the, if I dare say, unscientific side of training, which is
Yeah.
where I, you know, spend a lot of my time thinking and planning and basing my decisions, and it's disingenuous. And for the record,
Well, as
I do follow him, but sometimes I don't look at his stuff. So yeah, I try
you
and stay
need to
away.
unfollow
Oh
him.
man,
You're a glutton for
man,
punishment,
I
man.
am a glutton for punishment. I am.
But yeah, no, like it's one of those things where it's like you know, as coaches, we're professional guessers, you know,
Yeah,
like you
yeah,
get better at guessing,
yeah,
but it's still guessing. You
yeah.
know, it's like I'm running this person through a reasonable progression scheme. They seem to be recovering right at the rate we want, and they're not moving in the right direction. So I'm going to look at their squat and I might speculate. It looks like their bracing mechanic is not great. Maybe their thoracic extensors look like they could be a bit stronger. Maybe it looks like they're so tight through the pecs and the shoulders that they're not actually able to, it's not that their upper back is weak, that they're not able to create a tight upper back because they're so tight. Like there's all of these things, right? You suspect, oh, it looks like your ankle mobility. It looks like, you know, your the strength of your adductors and blah, 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 right? We got all these things that I could guess that would be reasonable guesses, and I could articulate to you why I think there is no studies to support anything against that or for it. There's nothing we could look to in that realm, even if we follow this premise of we should always look to the high level evidence first because anecdotal experience sucks. Well, there is none. I'm guessing now,
Yep,
you know,
yep.
and I want to be, and to be good at lifting or to be good at coaching, you need to get good at that guessing. We can't just defer judgment to studies all the time. I would say, go so far as to say the majority of the time, we don't have that privilege of deferring. We need to be able to look at things and subjectively appraise. And sometimes we're going to be wrong, you know, of course. But the more we do it, the better we get at these appraisals of appraising what a specific athlete needs to do to get better. You know, I wouldn't even go so far as to say I'm anti-science. I just think that in practical application in my day-to-day job, I can't say I'm calling upon it very often. It's very trendy. Like these guys I respect will call themselves evidence-based, but I would be very curious if I was a little fly on their wall watching them do their day-to-day job, how often they're using subjective training calls that are very good because these are good coaches that I respect, and how often they're deferring to the limited literature that applies to what it is that we're doing. But it's trendy to put it in your bio, and I get that.
It absolutely is. And you know what? I bring that up in one of my old videos. I go, how much science has to influence your training decisions or programming decisions as a coach before you can legitimately call yourself evidence-based? Like
Yeah,
what amount of decisions do you make that are just, oh, I know what I'm doing? Or I'm pretty sure I
yeah.
know what's best for this client versus I'm going to reference the study to see what the volume level would be. And then there's so many problems because I mean, we could go off all day on science, so I won't bore you or the audience to death, but you have this range that says 10 to 20 sets. That's a big gap. That's a big gap.
That's
That's off
double,
by a factor
double.
of two.
That's a yeah,
Cool.
that's a lot.
And then that's even within one study, but then you go across studies and then you see a disparity between them. So even then, even if they go, I'm going to base this off of literature, now they still have to play the guessing game and the decision game of, well, we're going to settle for something that seems like maybe a reasonable average across these things. And whether or not that's a good decision will have to stand the test of time. It took time to produce that study, but whether or not your choice based on that literature, whether that translates to good results, now has to be placed into people who are your guinea pigs, who are your anecdotes. And if it doesn't work, now someone like Menno Henselman is going to say, "Well, those are anecdotes, bro." It's like, oh, come on.
Yeah. That's why I don't follow him. So that's my
Yeah,
trick.
yeah,
But yeah, no, that's a great question. It's like, what is the cutoff for evidence based, right? Because like I think you could make a pretty sound argument that like, hey, we've got enough literature that maybe we could say our how we start someone for the first time, we just start working with them. We could say our initial prescription is fairly rooted in evidence, and that's how we came to it. That's fine. I could respect that. You know what I mean? But from there, all you're doing is making observations and judgment calls about, hey, what are your, like Paris always says, like a needs analysis, a wants analysis, right? What are you trying to get better at? What do you not really care about? Let's look at your recovery. Let's scale our volume accordingly. Let's make adjustments in our exercise selection, right? And we all make all these adjustments from there. So like, okay, at best, that starting point could be very heavily evidence-based for the most part. But then from there, it's more tailored to the individual, right? Yeah, no, I've wondered this myself. Is like, would I qualify as evidence based? Because I make some effort to keep up to date with literature. I like to think I'm familiar with a lot of the evidence based talking points. I'm by no means a master of it. I think I know people a lot more informed on study design and statistical analysis, and they could rip me to shreds. Like I would not want to get into a science argument with them, right? But I definitely feel looking around that there are people below my scientific literacy that call themselves evidence based, who don't seem to read anything. So then it's just this weird, like, kind of holier than thou title without any work behind. Because it's like, okay,
yeah.
it's not the walk that you and I have chose to be this ultra like by the books every morning. I'm checking because I got my notifications turned on for 3 keywords on PubMed. I get every time there's a study with this keyword, it shows up in my email and I read it. There are people that do that, and I respect them. It's hard. I respect
Your
people that do things that
bio,
are hard.
okay, for the audience, Sam's bio on Instagram has how heavy he can lift. It doesn't have a list of science-based certifications. And that is the
I don't know
greatest
if you
own to the science-based kids.
I don't know if you've seen. I've got a repost page for some of the guys I coach on Instagram. My bio is I have no qualifications. Um, but yeah, no. So it's like I respect the people that do like the really hard, like the really up to date version. I've got a tremendous. It's not the road that I've chosen because I think that if you're looking at the best performing coaches, that's not what I'm seeing. So I choose to follow in their footsteps, right? But I respect them a good bit, and I think that they can wear that with a badge of honor because they do the work behind. It's weird when someone has this very weird holier than thou science based thing when they also are very, very obviously not doing the work behind the scenes to even be what they claim to be. We can get into whether they should be trying to be that or not, but it's even worse when people aren't even that. Like, I know your pet peeve is when people are too crazy by the science. It's even more my pet peeve when people present themselves as this greater than you figure when they're not even what they're presenting.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Whatever the presentation is, doesn't they don't live up to it
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that drives me nuts as well. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's such a tragedy too, right? Like you can imagine a scenario, and this is a very realistic scenario. Someone as a coach, someone is watching these videos, and you try and critique their pro. You're just, you're a friend. Maybe you're the next potential coach, and you're like, hey, I think effort is a big gap in your program, and accountability and testing, whether that's one rep max, trying to push a new rep PR, whatever it is that we can discern as effort, seeing the sweat, the face, all that stuff. I think effort is a big gap. That has potential to come off as like, oh, a personal insult against me. How dare you say that? And then they can say as a defense, I hired a science-based coach. I watched all these videos. I'm doing the optimal exercise. It's based on EMG. So they're just like racking up this big legal
Yeah.
defense of all these fancy terms. And you're like, bruh, you're not even sweating. It's like,
Yeah. Well, and
how do you merge the gap there?
that's funny. Max and I talked about this about 3 months ago. I was saying it's so weird that like online strength training is like the only space in which if you say, hey coach, what am I doing wrong? Right? Saying you're not working hard enough is considered dodging the question, right? If we look at any other physical endeavor, right, that is taken at face value as okay, that is what coach is telling me is the problem, is that I need to try harder. It's like if I'm a sprinter, and I've got this routine of okay, well, here's how I break up my splits. I'm doing moderate distances, I'm doing short intervals, I'm working on my technique as far as my sprinting. I've got this approach.
Yeah.
And I go to my coach and I say, hey, coach, I'm not getting better. And the coach says, well, I've seen you doing your drills.
Mm-hmm.
You are not going hard enough. That is considered a very, very legitimate, it's not considered this tiny brain take. It's
Yeah, yeah.
considered an appraisal from authority, right?
Yep.
That knows what they're talking about. And they've successfully probably identified that to be the problem. You say the same thing on a football field. You say the same thing in a boxing ring. It's just like, hey, man, I've seen you doing your road. You're just sandbagging. That's why you're gassing. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not what we're doing. It's the intensity at which you're applying to it is falling short. And that's not considered a cop out. But then you get into this online realm of, oh, I'm running this program and it got me bad results. You trained like a coward. The program was fine. Like I watched you do it and you trained like you were scared of working hard. It's crazy, right? And that's considered a meat. It's very odd because like there are some people that will say that you're giving them like a cop out answer for like, oh, just work harder, bro. But no, you're just saying that because of your genetics and steroids. It's like, no, like I'm just I watched you train today, and you trained pathetically. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
and I'm sure we can all see this. People who make it to this video probably take it to their training pretty seriously, and they can look around the gym, and they're probably outperforming their peers at the gym, and the peers at the gym are like, oh, is this genetics? And you're like, oh my, all of you guys, like, even if you're just a guy, you're at the YMCA and you got to like a 275 bench press. Some YMCAs have some real beefy guys, but let's say an average YMCA,
Sure,
you're pretty
sure.
high with a 275 bench.
Oh
And
yeah.
everybody's like, oh, damn, that guy just must have good genetics. And you look around and you're like, you guys are idiots. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a genetic freak at this 275 bench. You guys are all just mailing in your training, not sleeping and drinking every weekend. Like, what are you talking about? It's the same thing. Every guy in high school that gets into training in high school, his buddies tag along with him.
Yep. Yep.
He outperforms his buddies. And to them, it's genetic. And to him, it's painfully obvious that his buddies aren't taking it seriously. Right.
Oh yeah.
And it's weird in like this online space to present this answer that, hey, it wasn't your frequency, it wasn't the progression scheme, it wasn't even really your technique. It was the raw effort you were applying to your accessories and to your primary lift. Where in sprinting, if I said, hey, you're sandbagging this, or in boxing, I said, hey, you're sandbagging this part of your training, you
Yep.
need to go harder. You need to
Yep.
turn that dial up. That's considered a very, like, that's actually that is a more thought out answer than anything I got while boxing. Like that would be, I would love if someone took that much detail to the approach I was taking. That would have been tremendously helpful to me. Right. So if I say, hey, you're just training, like you're not working on your accessories, you need to turn that dial up. For some reason on the online space, that is considered a cop out and a meathead answer. And that the answer needs to be frequency or progression scheme or what program do I run or the Candido 6 week has this flaw, you know, might be true, but the first and foremost thing that an experienced lifter is going to identify as your deficit is just the effort. I like the word intensity as bodybuilders
Oh, sure.
use it as far as
Yeah, yeah,
just training hard.
yeah.
I people always get that big pretentious thing. Actually, intensity means percentage of 1 rep max, and absolute intensity just means the weight on the bar. Colloquially, words can have more than one definition. I know that's a really high level concept, but every time you correct somebody and say, actually, intensity means this, you look like a goober. Things can
You
have
do.
more than one
You
meaning.
do.
And if we go into a gym and I say, what does intensity mean? They'd be, oh, like training hard, like grunting, like sweating. And you're like, oh, no, actually, I've got a 4 year degree and it means this. Dude, their definition, just by the nature of how language works, is as valid as yours, right? Academia doesn't pick what words mean. The masses pick what words mean, right? So it's not wrong. Intensity evokes this image of like Dorian Yates going like ham on a hack squat. That sometimes is a helpful image to evoke. So maybe the problem is your intensity, you know? Um, yeah,
Amen.
that's the one thing
Amen,
that
brother.
really winds me up is like I've gotten people like giving me these really disappointed answers on Instagram. Like they'll send me a message, they'll send me some stuff, they'll say, "Hey, can you help me out?" And be like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" I've got a spare 5 minutes. I'm happy to help. You know, um, and they give me these like, "Oh, sure, whatever, bro. Like, keep your secrets to yourself." Then what the
Yeah, if I had
crazy?
5 minutes to pick your brain to like address a deficit in my training approach, my methodology, even my technique, if you looked at a video, I would consider that like that's an enormous favor, right? That's a wonderful thing to offer someone, and to just like scoff at it, right? Like
Yeah,
that's it's just such a
it's people
prideful thing
come.
to do.
Well, I
Ridiculous.
think part of it is not just that it's prideful. Stan Efferding calls these people assholes, where you're not the first person they're asking. You're not the 10th person they're asking. They have sent this question out in mass because they have an answer they're looking for.
That's
They're
right.
looking for
That's right.
somebody to tell them to like take Tren or do Bulgarian. They've got some goofy answer in their head that they're looking for anyone they could call an authority figure to validate it. And then they
Yeah.
just blow you off and go to the next guy. Hi, Odie.
Yeah.
They blow you off and go to
I
the
already.
next guy if you don't give the one that they're looking for. You
Yeah, yeah.
know,
Like, give me an exotic Russian study from the 80s that's gonna tell me to do the thing that I want that is like very out there. It's like, no, no, I'm not
yeah.
gonna do
Well,
that.
I had a guy message me the other week. He goes, "What steroids should I take to increase my bench press specifically? My other two are good." I'm like, that is the most unhinged question I have ever received. That is that is your first question. Have you tried pausing your like he didn't like he wasn't pausing his benches. He was benching like once a week. I'm like, there are so many things that would be a logical question before that. This is so it's so odd. He seemed like a nice guy too. I really have nothing against the guy, but I was like, I feel like you have missed the train by about 3 hours on this one.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Big time. Big time. Oh boy. Yeah. Yeah. Which compound do I need? The compound you need is a compound movement. It's called
Yeah,
bench press, son. You got to do it.
yeah, yeah. Right. Do it a little bit more often.
Yeah. 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 Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. But I love your point on the intensity, right? It's almost like we could start teasing those people and be like, hey, every time you correct someone on terminology in the comment section, you lose an inch off your arm. Like that's proof that you're
Yeah,
skinny.
yeah. That's one that's always winds me up a little bit. Just again, it's that holier than thou when you really haven't earned it. You haven't earned nothing, no right to talk down to
Yeah,
people
not hurting. You're a
just because
pupil.
you
Yeah.
attended. Yeah, you had a weird little undergrad degree, which I can say that lovingly because I also have a weird little exercise physiology undergrad degree, so I'm allowed to say that. But you got a weird little undergrad degree that wasn't that hard to get,
No.
and now you're going to talk down to people as
Yeah,
if
yeah.
they're not better at the activity they're engaging with than you are, right?
Well,
Which
when
is
I was in
very odd.
school, it was like exercise science had this reputation of being an easy gateway into like higher level education. Like if you want to be a doctor, take kinesiology and get straight A's because it's easier than just like a straight up biology degree or pre-med
Yeah,
sciences, something like that, right? Like it's like you're
yeah,
literally you're like the bottom of the barrel of things that already otherwise have problem in academics themselves. So
yeah. Well, like I'll put it up there. Like it varies by program. There are
definitely,
some people with
definitely.
their school has a very rigorous program,
Oh yeah.
and respect to you for making it through. You know what I mean? Like I like to think that my school had a pretty good program because they had a pretty well accredited physical therapy post grad program.
Right.
And so you go exercise physiology to physical therapy or occupational therapy, and like that was like the pipeline. It was pretty rigorous, but also respectfully, I finished that, and I was the only person in my class I would feel comfortable. having right exercise routines. I would say my classmates, like I liked my program. I had a lot of respect for my classmates. It was a relatively small school. I thought they were pretty picky with like their teachers. And I felt my classmates knew a lot about physiology and anatomy and could rattle off all of these things that were going to set them up for success because all of them were planning on going into occupational therapy or physical therapy, which I think are very noble professions. Awesome for them. I don't think a single person there knows how to write a good exercise program because that's just not covered in, I would say, 90 to 95% of the curriculums of exercise physiology programs aren't even teaching you the basics of program design. So you're not, unfortunately, by finishing your 4-year degree, you put a lot of money, you put a lot of thought into it. You are not an authority yet in writing exercise training programs because that's not what your degree was in. Some, like at the school that Dr. Mike teaches at. I'm sure you finished Dr. Mike's classes and you can say, okay, well, yeah, I literally like Dr. Mike gave me failing and passing grades. I feel pretty comfortable charging for this. But going to most programs, at best, it's one class with very, very bad information with no practical application whatsoever. You're not the authority figure you think you are yet. You could be, but a lot of that's going to come from actually do it. Like specificity applies to everything. The best way to get better at coaching is to coach. Getting passing anatomy and physiology, sure, that could be a good base, but that's not what we're doing. You know what I mean? Like if you wanted to get better at powerlifting, you wouldn't go run sprints. You would start powerlifting. Maybe running some sprints alongside it could be a good idea, but that's the same thing. Is like if you want to get better at coaching, you have to start getting into like writing programs and trial and erroring and like do it for free for your butt. If you want to coach, do it for free for your friend.
Yep.
While you get, if your parents want you to go get a degree, go get a degree. If you want to go get a degree, go get a degree. But start doing the actual coaching alongside that. It's like
100%.
There's no point in
That's
delaying.
where I started coaching. And I was lucky that, when I was all done with school, it was like the advantage that I have over more than 90% of the class is that I already have 2 years of work experience. And yeah, the people I started off with was a very general population where having tons of years of experience obviously would have helped. But the fact that I'm like programmally retarded doesn't matter because I have the common sense and wisdom not to push 50 and 60-year-old people to unreasonable realms. I have a basic understanding of progressive overload, movement quality, rep quality, things like that. And if you can give that in a concise package to people, you can help the normies get a lot better. And they're not looking to set powerlifting records. So if effort gets people there in the first place, guess what? You're instilling that effort into them, plus just a tiny bit of knowledge and wisdom. You can be, if you want to work with Gen Pop, you don't have to be an expert. You just have to not be retarded. And that's really the truth about like personal training. So when you see a personal trainer like texting or just like deferring to some EMG thing, it's gone, forget about it. You're disqualified until you can come back and demonstrate common sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like I just talked in the comments to Mr. Jeffrey Verity Schofield about that on my last video, where it's just like, yeah, if you're training for general health and well-being, you probably shouldn't get hurt. You should be risk averse enough in your approach that we should probably be able to avoid anything meaningful. But if you've got ambitious goals, we have to toe that line a little bit more. And people think you're crazy for saying that you're risking injury, or people like, oh, you never get hurt. You're training like a coward. Just different goals. You know what I mean?
I saw that comment and I thought you put it nicely because it's
yeah,
true.
I think it's just simple.
Yeah. Well, the goals get ambitious. Yeah. You accept risk. But here's another, I'll get into this hot take. I want to hear your thoughts on it. This is where, even Tom Platz, the guy who, like worked so hard, he tore a bicep, the guy could squat, the famous 525 by 23, like high bar squat, deep, burying every single rep, just to push himself for that. I don't know if it was a charity event or competition, whatever the context was there. But I mean, even he says risk should not greatly exceed reward. We chase it, we expect risk to be there, but do you want this trailing behind effect where you can chip away the next thing without getting snapped up? Because how else are you going to do this for decades? How can you be a champion?
Well, exactly.
Snapped up. It just doesn't work.
Well, exactly, right? So it's like this idea that, like that's exactly why I like to use the phrase like toe the line, right? It's like we have to look for our upper capacities if we're going to chase these ambitious goals, right? For sure. We're not going to get there unless you're half Thor Bjornsson. Then maybe you could not even toe that line and you might even be able to get there. But anything shy of that, if we've got ambitious goals, we need to be toeing that line. And we're going to make mistakes in our process of toeing that line. But going above that line is not making us any closer to the goal. injuries are setbacks in our progression towards the goal. So this idea that people have of, oh, well, accepting a little bit more injury risk makes me move towards my goal. That means that must go on forever. The more injury risk I accept, the more I'm going to reach. And it's like you see this tremendously bad in strongman and untested powerlifting, where people think, oh, compromising my health a little bit makes me chase my goal. Like that way, but then infinitely compromising my health and just dying makes me get my goal even faster. It's like, no, if you're reaching kidney failure in 6 months, you're going to lose to the guy that towed the line for 10 years and played that game. It was really precise and took care. Shockingly, taking care of yourself improves your athletic endeavors. Shockingly, right?
Well,
but it's
and
like
the same thing's true with adaptation. You talk about you can adapt to positions and tissues. I mean, you don't want to find out what the limits of that are. Like there are some positions and postures of a squat, deadlift, and bench you don't want to spend a lot of time in. I don't care what people want to say about adaptation. Like there is such a thing as doing a lift wrong, and it will have consequences eventually, right? Like there's a reason
yeah,
why
the
you're going to be
way
a stickler for technique with your
yeah
athletes.
the way I think about it, right, is most of all we could get into a discussion of, let's just say, like you're rounding the hell out of your lumbar spine, because
Yeah,
I think
sure.
it's pretty well accepted. Like like the thoracic spine is built in such a way it's clearly meant to flex, right?
Totally,
So
totally. Yeah,
most high level deadlifters are in a somewhat flexed thoracic
yeah.
position. It lengthens your arms, improves blah blah blah. But I
It
feel like
helps.
the consensus, yeah, exactly. The consensus among people that know what they're talking about is like, hey, if you can control some thoracic rounding, that's fine. That's an advanced deadlift technique. We should probably stay away from lumbar rounding no matter what, right? And I feel like that's the consensus. Now we can get into a debate about, well, if we always do that with good load selection, like the barbell medicines guys might say, let's say we have good load selection, we got good load management.
Yeah.
Could we just build up this position indefinitely? The answer is maybe, maybe not. I don't really care because either way, mechanically, we are not using a good, like, because good form is not just good form because of this idea of injury risk, it's mechanically efficient, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Physics still apply. We want mechanically efficient form, right? So it's like, I don't want to see my athlete having a heavy lumbar round
Yeah.
because they're going to have the worst lockout I've ever seen.
Oh yeah.
So we're going to avoid that just for the sake of their progression, whether
Of
I
course.
feel the injury risk is elevated or not. Now, the reason I feel the injury risk is probably elevated is because I think that anybody that deadlifts like that does not actually have very good control of what they're doing, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas like a guy who pulls with a rounded thoracic has good positional control
Yeah,
usually. So
he's
then
locked in. Yeah. Oh yeah.
exactly. And so I don't even have an opinion on it really, because I don't really care, because I don't want to see any of my athletes doing that for other reasons.
Yeah.
Whether this rounded low back is inherently a little bit more injurious or not, or whether we could acclimate to it, I don't want you to acclimate to it, because
Yep.
that's not
Yep.
how high performers lift
And it's
ever.
not the point. That the point isn't to be like infinitely adaptable. The point is to be good at the lift. And the more you get into this crazy technique for the sake of adapting, the further you are away from your goal in the first place, right? You know?
Exactly, right. So it's like, just again, it ties back to the whole, just because you could doesn't mean you should. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, we probably could, if you were just like hell bent on it, you could get really strong and not hurt yourself, right? At this round lumbar spine deadlift.
Yeah.
But why? But
But
why?
why? But
It's
why?
like, if our goal is to deadlift as much as possible, we should probably be tailoring our form to lift as much as possible. And in my opinion, there's a little bit's fine, but like there's a very concrete limit to, okay, excessive lumbar rounding equates to a very poor lockout position. I would rather see that deadlift be a little bit more smooth. Kind of the same thing applies to other things that, like, people might suspect are inherently injurious, right? Like some positions on the squat. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I'm not super invested in finding out, because I don't think that's the best way for this athlete to achieve their goals regardless. Performance dictates first and foremost. I don't want you doing that. The only one I can think of that is a cause for reasonable debate is knee cave, right? Because like I'm sure you've heard the talking point that knee cave isn't purely knee valgus, it's just internal rotation of the femur, right? Which might not be a bad thing, because the adductor magnus is a huge extensor as we drive out of the bottom of a squat. And that internal rotation just means the adductor is doing something.
Yeah.
So it's
What
like,
direction does it pull the femur? Hmm.
yeah, right. And so it's like, the whole Chinese weightlifting team, many of them cue knees in,
Yeah. And it
and
comes
they
in.
do it for
Yeah.
a whole career,
Mm-hmm.
and they adapted to it, and it's fine. So that's
Yeah.
the only one that I'll see people like, oh, that's a dangerous position. I'm like, I don't even think that's, I don't know if you're right. Again, I think it's a matter of whether the athlete has control of it.
Yeah.
I think that might factor in a little bit. Just like the round, there's a big difference between a guy who pulled his whole preparation with a flat back, loads up 105%, and then rounds it.
Yeah.
Sure, round back through the thoracic might be okay, but he didn't control it and he didn't do it on purpose. Whereas the weightlifter, right? If somebody is knowingly keeping like equal pressure in their feet, that's a big part of it in my mind. But equal pressure through their feet and their knees are coming in and they have control of it, I'm not too worried about it. Like there's a certain degree to which I might start worrying eventually, but for the most part, that's the adductor contributing as it's supposed to, right? Whereas if every one of their reps on their warm-ups had knees out and then they crash in at a heavyweight, then it's a breakdown. It's not a deliberate strategy. And that's going to be very different. And then I also think when people have uncontrolled, that inward shift to the knees, it shows in their foot pressure, right? Whereas if you watch the weightlifting team, their foot pressure stays very even.
Yeah,
They're still weight
yeah, exactly.
front to back and then side to side, right? There's equal pressure on their inner foot and their outer foot, roughly ish, right? Whereas if you see someone who's very uncontrolled knee crash, right, they're coming really hard on the inside of their feet. And that's where we might be looking at maybe an elevated, I wouldn't say maybe. That's probably an elevated injury risk because that's not the motor pattern you prepare. I think even the barbell medicine guys would agree with that because we didn't build up that tolerance even in that position. I would argue it's probably not even a good position to be in, but we didn't prepare it. So no matter what, that's a bad idea.
And I would never consider myself like the resident expert in squatting or biomechanics or anything, but for myself and for my clients, when I'm cueing a back squat, one of the reasons why I'll often cue knees out on the way down is like you're saying, there's a natural pulling in of the knees from the adductors. It's like I'm making room for their knees to come in. They push out on the way down, knowing that they're going to come in on the way up, whether you like it or not, because your adductors are working. So if you start with them super forward and then they cave in, well, maybe that's a worse position than if you bow out just a bit and then it comes up straighter rather than start straighter and bow in and look really gross. But obviously, like you said, the Olympic lifters are going to have a fairly exaggerated degree compared to some people, and they're fine. Now, whether or not those guys have sore knees, I don't know. I don't know how beat up their knees are, right? Olympic lifters will talk about, different parts of the body getting beat up and not being a big deal. Like I've heard the Seeker Strength boys talk about how beat up knees is not as bad as like beat up like wrists and shoulders. So maybe even then there's like they're willing to make a trade-off in their career for weight, and then they'll have beat up knees. But I mean, I'd have to do more research on that to see what these guys are feeling like before I make any judgment on that, right? So
there is one study that was like it was supposed to be like a rebuttal to like the deep squats being bad, right? Where they looked at like the knee health of lifelong weightlifters. And they've got very robust knees. They've adapted a lot.
Awesome.
Maybe they hurt for sure, but like they've made positive adaptations. Like not surprising knowing what we know now, but at the time that was a big deal because people thought like knees over toes was going to kill you.
Oh yeah,
But the way I like often, obviously you need to tailor the cues to the athlete. Like if I say do this and it just doesn't register, we need to look for similar phrasings that are different enough because we're looking for the same thing to happen with most athletes. It's going to look a little different with their proportions and their stances and all that, but
100%.
we're looking for the same general principles, but we need to have a bag of 10 phrasings. Right? So you rotate through them. But usually when I'm coaching the squat, I usually like to tell people, don't cram the knees out from the very start, because I think a lot of the time, if we think knees out from the very beginning of the squat, we end up in this extremely exaggerated position where nobody is going to have the stability or strength in their hips to maintain it. And they're actually going to get worse knee crash by aggressively cueing knees out the whole time. So usually how I've kind of moved to coaching it is descend with relatively like a neutral femur angle. And then as you start to reach towards 90 degrees, towards the hole, then we're cramming the knees out, just like you said, to make room for the knees to then shift back in. But that way we're not ending up in this extremely exaggerated position. But that's I've kind of come to that over time as my personal.
Yeah, you don't need to do it when you're fully upright. You don't need to move
exactly
fully upright.
People will like start cramming their knees out from the very start because they're just like, I heard knees out, and they end up in this position that like they would need like Dan Green level hip strength to maintain it. So instead, it's better let's work within our capabilities of our hip strength, which for most people isn't that much. Descend in this relatively neutral pattern because most people that aren't excessively heavy or excessively musculature, like are excessively muscled, aren't going to be in this really abducted position. They squat with relatively neutral femurs. So let's go down with the neutral femurs. And then once we start reaching that bottom portion, Then we're thinking about driving the knees out. Then we're thinking about
Yeah.
creating that external rotation. So then as we drive out of the hole, the femurs can internally rotate. And the idea in my head, right, as we go down, the knees are neutral. We hit the bottom, they shift out slightly because we're driving out in the bottom. And then as we come out of the hole, they shift
close.
back to neutral. Not
They
past
close.
that point, but back to that neutral, right? Again, we're giving room for the femur to internally rotate and the adductor to drive us out of the hole, but we're returning back to that neutral. And that's kind of, it's really romanticized on paper. You don't need to squat like that, but that's very much the way that I've kind of leaned into coaching them. Because I used to think, oh, well, let's try knees out. Well, let's try spread the floor. Let's try root the feet. And all of these things, I think, for athletes that aren't like really bodily aware, we're just like, what the hell are you saying to me, Sam? Whereas if I'm just saying, when you get to the bottom, try to push your knees apart and then stand up. It works pretty good.
It works pretty good. I think so. And that's you said something there like making room for the femurs. That's how I've described it to people too. I'm like, hey, this is like, even more of a precedent if you've got like those long boy femurs. Like I saw someone stand strength. I think this was a client of his, so I'm not sure, but you could see the guy's femur was very clearly shorter than like his tibia, and it was a beautiful back squat, ATG, like no heels elevated. It was just wonderful. Like the guy's just a squatter. Whereas if you're like me, I don't know about your build, but it's like you look at the sideways and you're like, my butt is way out here because I've got these gargantuan femurs and like a midget torso, and it's just it is what it is. But when I have even my heels are fairly close together. My toes are out from the start because I'm making room for, if this is my femur and I open up, I'm shortening the lateral distance of my femur. So it just makes work.
Yeah, exactly. Like the more we can abduct and the more we can externally rotate. If we just looked at it from a pure side perspective, like you said, it looks like your femur is getting shorter, and that lets you maintain a bit more of an upright posture. That's why you'll see, that's why I always like when you're looking for a technical model, right? And you're looking for you're like, I want to get really good at squatting, and I want to tailor my own technique. One thing you can do is look for a technical model of someone with similar proportions to you, right? There are longer limbed, very good squatters.
Oh yeah.
Watching Lu Xiaojun, for example, is going to do you no good. You're just going to be really angry that your squat doesn't look.
You're going to hate yourself.
Yeah, you're just like, damn, why am I not 5'4" in Chinese? This sucks, right? Like my squat will never look like that. And it's like you're right. You are 100% correct. Your squat will never look like that because it could not unless you get bone changing surgery, right? Whereas what you could do is you could seek out, well, where is a very good squatter, like someone who's performing at the upper echelons with a build similar to mine, and what strategies does he lean into to make up for this, right? And you will see exactly that. You'll usually see the really good longer limb squatters. Do you know who Andrew Herbert is?
No, I don't think so.
He's a guy who trains at Dan Green's gym. He's a former 242 record holder as well as a squat record holder, and he does not have short femurs. But what he does is he does take that little bit wider stance. The toes are a little bit more out, and he's had to build up a lot of muscle in the hips to maintain this more abducted position. And it lets him maintain a posture that if he was neutral with a narrow stance and the toes relatively straightforward, he would be folded in half, like chest to knees, and have to stand up. So it's like you can look for people built or like just the same. I'll look around and I'll say, okay, who's a deadlifter that's pulling a lot with short arms and a long torso? So an unfavorable build, right? What strategies did they lean into? And that's kind of where I got this idea of, okay, I'm going to probably need to learn to master this rounded thoracic position because my positions off the floor, my start position is going to be so bad from my short wingspan that I need to artificially improve it by lengthening my arms through this protraction, through this depression, and then locking in this little bit better position. And then I'll figure it out to make sure my lockout's still smooth. But I noticed everybody deadlifting well with a build similar to mine. I was like, some variance in like stance and how they're distributing loads, how much they're using the leg varies a little bit, but everybody's using the same strategy to try to overcome it. And that's where you can find these really helpful technical models. Like I like that opinion of yours. What is the big guy doing? What is the strong guy doing? That strong guy that's smart and is built like me, how did he do it? I'm going to copy it. That sounds like a good idea.
Absolutely, man. That's such a beautiful way to put it too, is not just look at, big, strong guys in general, but it's going to come down to how do I execute this movement? And for you to look for someone as a similar build, that's like one of the best pieces of advice we could give the audience really right there. Like that's a fantastic way to look at it. And I have this idea too, where it's like, maybe you agree, where efficiency doesn't just take priority for the sake of like, we want weight on the bar because you and I both care about those numbers. I'm not competitive. My numbers are nowhere near I would feel ashamed to show up at a powerlifting meet at this point. So I'm going to give that a little while before I try that. But no, it's like you want the
You'd be
efficiency.
surprised. You
Yeah.
wouldn't be too out of place.
Oh yeah. Okay. All
Like
right.
at
Well,
local
I
meets,
appreciate that.
don't put it off too much.
Yeah.
Put it on the docket. I think you'd like it. I think it'd be fun, and the barrier is not very high.
Well, it'd be good to get it under the belt just to say it's on there, right? And then, like you said,
Yeah,
extended off season, come back, crushing it. But
yeah,
it's not just about the weight, it's also to protect yourself, where if you do things to game the movement, you're sort of like protecting yourself. For me, I've got these nice long arms. I don't know if they exceed I'm also 5'10". I don't know if they exceed, wingspan exceeds height, but whatever, either way, for me, the arch is essential. And, arching, does that benefit probably everyone? Yeah, to a degree, right? You're going to get better moment arm, decreased range of motion. For me, it's how I stop my rotator cuff from having pain, and I stop my triceps from just doing enormous amounts of work to the point where my elbow tendons can't take it. Just shortening that range of motion makes a big difference. For you, it's the protraction plus the rounding, right? Artificially lengthen the arms. For me, or Lane Norton, or that other gentleman you mentioned, it's how do I get that position for the hips and the femurs for the squat. So it's sort of like whatever you're not built for, you're going to have to sort of unlock this ability to game your leverages. It'll make you stronger. And I think it stands to reason it'll protect your joints as well to a degree. So,
yeah. Because it's just more efficient, like you said. Whereas like you need to distribute, like you said with the same thing, you need to distribute the loading across the movers as best you can. And what that looks like for different people, the proportions of what we're using, right? Like you're gonna use more posterior chain in your squat than I am, but we're both looking to use both posterior chain and the quads.
yeah.
Like if you're only using one of those, you're in for a bad time in terms of you're going to have a very hard time managing your loads to avoid injury. You have a very hard time lifting as much weight as you could. You're still trying to strike a balance between the two, but each person's balance is going to be a little bit different. And you could even say the same thing with like, well, I'm favorably built for this. What about the people that are really good with my leverages for that? What strategies are they leaning into to get even more out of it? You know what I mean? Um,
Even more.
or maybe the guys pulling with a little bit more of a flat back because they can with their longer arms, or are they leaning into that? It's like it's just these questions you could ask. It's like,
Yeah.
are the guys with the? I've noticed like a lot of guys with shorter arms in the bench press will often use a narrower grip. I've definitely observed that to be a little bit more common in guys with a favorable build. Are the ones that also find that their best competitive width is a little closer. Could I tell you why that is? Not really, but it's something I noticed, and it could be something for someone to experiment with in their training. But yeah, it's like we can always like high level sport is like the testing ground of theory, right? Does it mean we can copy high level performers verbatim? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. They're making mistakes. Some people are where they are despite what they're doing. But the idea is if we have these paradigm shifts, they're going to be tested at the highest level of sports. And if they're really worth their weight, the guys that are implementing these paradigm shifts are going to slowly outperform the other guys, and then everybody's going to adopt it. And that's how we get better, right? So it's like, I don't think we can necessarily completely separate the idea of like the academic and the theoretical from the competitive, because to a certain degree, that is the proving ground, right? And much the same, if we're trying to get better at lifting, we should be looking into both of these pools, of people who are extremely emotionally invested in beating the other people at this thing. They're trying a lot of things. Maybe we could learn from them. Same thing. There are people who are very interested in examining this physiology and trying to look for best practice. We can look into that too, but we should never overlook drawing from high performers in terms of their training strategies, in terms of their technical strategies. Like, yes, some of them are not smart and are genetic freaks, and some of them are very smart who are doing better than they have any right to. They like on paper they shouldn't be there, and they did such a good job over 15 years that they're there anyway. And that is the guy that I'm going to listen to every single word he has to say. You got to be able to identify which is which, but that's going to be like one of the things I'm going to look to.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, and you pointed this out too. It's like not only did you put in like a really solid 10 years, but you don't miss sessions. And that's another takeaway for people is like, look, if you're serious about this, we're not saying you have to be 100% all in to get stronger and get bigger and even achieve some, more than moderate success, even great success if it's not elite end. But look, the less training sessions you miss, the less reps you fail because you overestimated your strength. However you want to put this, the less you're missing out on these things and making these dumb decisions, you're going to get there. You're going to make not only the years go by and therefore add up training experience, and we can say more training experience is a very good predictor of more progress, more results, whether that's the size of the arms, whatever, or the weight that you're going to be lifting and competitive success. But what is the meaningfulness of those years? Because I've definitely looked back on my training and thought some of those years were not productive as others. So if you can get the most out of the time and not hurt yourself, well, man, it's just you're just leveling up your gains. And that's where people like Jeffrey Berry Schofield, I believe natural hypertrophy, and some other people have talked about this. Actually, probably Paris has too, where he's been training his calves more, or switching up some of his stuff to be more Johnny bodybuilder mode. It's like unlocking new gains. Is it because he's on steroids now? No, no, no. It's not like that. It's there was a deficit in approach, in mindset, in well-roundedness, and certain areas weren't being pushed progression. They were being sandbagged in the past, and you were content to it because you had these like 5 other things that you were just excelling, blowing everyone else in the gym out of the water, where you had a you got a little ahead of yourself, and now you're not investigating your deficits because you're the shining star. So why is the shining
Yep.
star going to have that internal dialogue, introspect and critique himself, where, hey, once you start to get those things up to par, all of a sudden it's like more newbie gains on top of your advanced
Yeah.
gains, and you just look like a monster within a couple of years of leveling that up. It's awesome.
Yeah. When so that's something like I've talked about with my girlfriend. It's very interesting, right? Is people say newbie gains is this time in the gym.
Yeah.
And it's like that doesn't no, you're wrong. Like I don't think you understand what this means. If someone goes in the gym for 5 years and they're doing everything wrong and they're mailing it in, and then on year 5 they fix everything and they start trying really hard, they're going to get newbie gains. You'd say, well, I've been in the gym for 5 years. That's irrelevant. You've been doing things really badly for 5 years. Start doing things really well and trying really hard and eating your meals, and you're going to experience they're just the newbie gains that you never got, you know. And it's the same thing with if I neglect it, like I could probably put like an inch on my biceps so quickly because I hate training biceps and I've never done it. You know, they're way behind the curve. I still haven't capitalized on my bicep newbie gains. So it's like if I said, okay, 3 days a week, I'm going to take some curls seriously, I could put a reasonable amount of size on my arms. You know, it's not because I did anything other than pick up a deficit, right? And so that's something. Don't feel disheartened if you're like, well, I've been in the gym for 3 years and I'm not that good yet. Well, frankly, you're not doing it that well. And
Yep.
you could be down on yourself, and that you could view that as an insult, or you could say, well, that means I've got the potential to be a lot better. This where I'm at in 3 years of subpar effort or subpar execution
Mhm.
is not indicative of my upper end potential at all. You should view that as something that's a little bit like that makes me happy. Oh wow, I could be a lot better. You know, this guy's only been lifting for 6 months and he's as strong as me, but he was taking it really serious, and you're not.
Yep.
That just
Yep.
means you have the potential to blow up. You know, so it's like you can take it either way, right? Because my girlfriend was in the gym for about 2 years, really kind of mailing it in, just kind of going to the gym. You know, she was following a well-written program, I like to think, because I wrote it. She like the program wasn't the problem, but she wasn't really emotionally invested in it. She wasn't really pushing herself. She wasn't going to eat her meals. She wasn't going to bed on time. And like she was like, "Oh man, do I have bad genetics? Like I see these other girls on Instagram and they're doing this lift." And I was like, "No." Like, and so then like about a year ago, she like, "I'm going to start taking this really serious." And in that year, she made more progress than the 2 years before that combined, right? So it's like your training age doesn't mean anything by itself. It's what
Mhm.
that training age is comprised of. You know, if my training age of 10 very serious years contains zero serious bicep work, I got newbie gains right here if I ever want to actually do that, right? So it's like training age alone means very little. You know, there's always that old guy in the gym who's been going to the gym for 20 years. I was like, that's crazy. You're an idiot. You're doing it back like you've been here for 20 years for nothing, and
Yeah.
you have not learned a thing in that 20 years. Just the training age itself, just as it isn't a qualification to tell you why I know what I'm doing something badly for 20 years isn't a qualification, right?
Not necessarily. Yeah. Yeah.
Much the same. It doesn't really inform you of very much, right?
Mhm.
So it's like, don't worry
Yeah, if
too
you're
much
if you're
about
in
your
your
training
local
age.
hub, not talking to anyone, not doing any research, just like convinced that you've got training figured out, and you're not getting bigger after another 5 years, another 5 years. I don't want to talk to you about training. You're gonna have
Well,
some like
I would do the exact
crackpot
opposite
theory,
of what you did, dude.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's like some guy who's just been doing like has gotten no progression over 20 years. And like, tell me what you're doing, and I will do the opposite. I'm not going to listen to you because you've been here for 20 years. That like that alone means nothing. And like you said, like reflecting back on your unproductive periods of training is just as helpful as reflecting on the ones where you got your best gains. Just like how I have a giant stack of notebooks. This is about 2 years of training right here. And in the closet, I have another 6 years of
Oh yeah.
training.
Yeah.
I can look back and see, okay, well, this was a successful training cycle on the squat. That can give me some hints as to what I need to do if my next goal is to chase down a big squat, right?
Oh yeah.
What you needed in the past isn't necessarily what you need now, right? So it's like it's not one to one, and just because something worked in the past, because it's like your weaknesses then might not be, you might have successfully fixed them, right? But
Yeah.
that's very helpful. But also, like you said, looking back on periods of training that were subpar and
Totally.
internalizing why you dropped the ball. Oh, I was really stressed out because of work, and I just wasn't thinking about it. I wasn't coming into the gym with a goal each day because I was so like tired from work, or I was like I wasn't eating my meals. Look, or it could be this was a mistake in your program. But looking back at the periods of lackluster progress and truly understanding why and acknowledging that that happened is unbelievably informative because we've all had it. I have been busting my ass training so much, and it's like my day is revolved around I'm eating 5 to 6 times a day for the last 10
Oh
years,
yeah.
and I still can look back at periods where I made lackluster progression. And I need to be like, yes, I was trying hard. Just because I was trying hard doesn't mean I was trying as hard as I could. And it also doesn't mean I was doing it right. And I would be a fool to not look at the trying and I was getting jacked back. I need to look at those and I need to know why so I can make sure they don't happen again.
So, yeah, yeah, that's absolutely right. You need to examine your own deficits and be honest about what went wrong. Don't delegate the blame to so and say, I fell victim to a social media trend. Maybe you did, but maybe you also should have thought a little bit more critically about the information that's being presented, right? Like,
Well, and
like there's,
shoot,
yeah,
you like you talked about earlier, you might have been able to make that social media trend work, you know? Like if you worked hard enough at it, like in powerlifting, right? I would say 3/4 of my competitive clients are powerlifters, like 1/4 are strongmen right now. You can see these waves of what's popular. Like there was this wave, like conjugate was this big wave of
oh yeah,
this
sure,
board presses, floor presses, all of these exercises. These are the trendy ones. And then there was a wave of like when good luck ever increasing your squat if you don't have a belt squat. It's so specific. It's like it's not specific at all. Like it's barely more specific than a leg press.
yeah,
Like, but people convince people that if they didn't have a belt squat, they were screwed, right? And
yeah,
you
yeah,
go and like there's
yeah,
these different waves, and I would say that like then there was a big wave of tempos, there was a big wave of a couple other exercises, and none of these exercises are abhorrently bad. So these trends aren't the worst thing in the world. They're exposing people to something they might not have tried otherwise. You get this buy-in from them, and hopefully you benefit from these. If you do it right and you're a level-headed person who's serious about your training, you're going to benefit from these trends because you're going to try it and you're going to take some things away and you're going to discard some things. And those are some new tools in your toolbox. And I've heard I forget who it was, somebody on Instagram was saying like the toolbox fallacy is saying that everything is a tool in the toolbox. Some tools are useless. You're never
hmm
going to use them and you're just cluttering your toolbox. Like you could say, well, every exercise has some benefit. It's just context specific. All right, man. A tricep kickback standing on a Bosu ball. You could play some mental gymnastics and tell me a context where that would work, but you're never going to run into that person. You're just cluttering your bag. I would rather have my
yeah,
bag filled with enough things that I really know how. I want to have tools that I am a master of and have enough of them. Having a medium amount to a small amount of proficiency with a million tools, no one's going to pay you to do anything. If you're really good with a couple, you're going to be doing a lot better, right? So it's like when these trends come by, belt squats, a good exercise. That's a great exercise. Tempos, awesome. That's a tool that's worth having in your tool belt. So it's like you can take away and put, and maybe some of them are useless. And if you're level headed, you're not going to do only tempos. So it's like if it wasn't a hit, you're not wasting time. You were just doing something that you needed to try out eventually to see if you're going to add it to your tool bag. So I think if you navigate these things without letting them completely derail your approach and just having them be an adjunct to your approach, we can go along with these trends and get more and more competent at programming and exercise selection. But the problem is when we go full like, I got to do everything is belt squatting, or I got to do everything is this thing. And you lose sight of your fundamentals that you've kind of seen past success from
yeah.
and disregard all of it. Then, yeah, you could waste time.
Yeah, you should start to have some discernment where you go, these things are foundational movements, front squat, back squat, deadlift, overhead press, behind the neck press. Like you start to see like these are the obvious big picture distinctions in equipment, and you know you could look at it from like calisthenics and barbells, and we can go on and on. But there's a point where adding more to it or like modified versions is not really that productive of a thing to try and master. And there's a point where you can say, you know what, I'm confident and I'm comfortable not doing that exercise ever for any period of time in my training career. And I'm not convinced that I'm actually missing out because I'm not doing dumbbell curls while squatting at the same time. Like I'm
Yeah,
really not missing out on something that's productive. You know, and
yeah,
there's sort of a fallacy where, you know, feels hard is conflated as hard. In the same way the optimal thing can get carried away. Someone might not be thinking scientific about, they go to a fitness class and they're doing stuff like that where it's like a squat overhead press with like 10-pound dumbbells, or like, you know, one-legged Romanian deadlift and then like a curl on the way up. And if you do enough of those with the right weight, it kind of feels hard. You're sweaty, it's burning. But it's like what you and I would know about energy systems. If a duration of an exercise set lasts long enough, 40 seconds, a minute, minute 20 seconds, almost anything feels hard. If you do it for a minute straight, you get a burn in the
yeah,
muscle. That's not, and if you compound those together with minimal rest, and such is the case for a lot of things, maybe not like CrossFit, but a lot of fitness classes, it's just like boom, 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 boom. You're gonna go through it, be like, man, I really worked up a sweat. That must have been really productive. If you didn't write it down, if you didn't push for a rep PR, if you didn't count the reps, if you didn't focus on a consistent depth that you need to hit, like sure, you could have made adaptations, and those might have carried over to other things, but feels hard isn't hard. And I can take almost anyone, I don't care how strong they are. You do 20 slow, deep body weight squats, you're going to feel a burn in your legs.
yeah,
But that same person, in so many cases, like for you, I don't know how many pounds it would be, like a gazillion, but even someone who's like more, I hate to use the term intermediate, but like they could take 135 for like 15 to 20 reps, bury that sucker, nice control. They can still do it. The 20 body weight squats got a nice nasty burn. The 20 with 135 got a much nastier burn, and you're more huffing and puffing. One of those produces gains, the other one doesn't.
yeah. What a lot of that just comes down to like directed adaptation, right? Where it's like,
Yeah,
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 the person I like classes because they are a way to use peer pressure to get people to work harder than they would
totally.
otherwise. In a
Totally.
perfect world, they're driven, right? And they do it themselves and they do it in a more directed manner. But I see the classes that go on at the gym and I'm like, these people are competitive with one another and it gets them to push to a level that they just wouldn't do by themselves. It keeps them accountable for showing up.
Oh
And
yeah.
like you
Yeah.
said, feels hard is not necessarily great for directing adaptation the way we want, but it is usually good enough to get a lot of the general health benefits of exercise, right? And that's, I always like when people use the differentiation between exercise and training.
Training.
Exercise is engaging in stuff that feels hard, and you're going to get a lot of the general health benefits. Even
Yeah,
these
yeah.
goofy like
Yeah, yeah.
curl lunge, you're going
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get some of those increases in bone mineral density. You're exposing yourself to way more resistance than if you were sitting at home or even going for a walk. You're exposing
Yeah.
yourself to
Yeah.
a resistance through your arms. That's
More than
awesome, right?
Pilates, more than yoga, or the classic doctor, oh, you got brittle bone disease, go for a walk and take calcium. It's
Exactly.
like, what?
Exactly. Right. So it's like, I think classes for people who are just interested in general health outcomes and they wouldn't be accountable to doing something that's more optimized are awesome. I'm weirdly pro classes just from watching people do them at the gym. They're working hard because
Oh
they
yeah.
think like the women's boot camp that goes on. You could tell that one of the women just thinks the other woman's a bum, and she's like, oh, "I'm not gonna let that bum outwork me, so I'm
Yeah,
gonna
yeah.
work really hard." They're going hard as hell. Good
Yeah.
for them, and
Yeah. And
they're
they're getting
breaking
the
a
sweat
sweat. They're getting
going. Yeah.
these they're getting this cardiac health benefits. They're getting all of these things, right? But it's very much not even a jack of all trades, master of none. We're getting a very poor relative aerobic stimulus compared to something that's more directed and overloaded. We're getting a very poor strength stimulus compared to something that's more directed. But if the goal is general health outcomes, that's fine. But if you've got goals anywhere past that, even if that goal is just getting jacked, jacked isn't general health. That's a slightly different thing. There's a lot of
Yeah.
overlap between the two, for
Definitely.
sure, especially
Yeah.
if you're not taking PEDs. There's a lot of overlap between the two. Outside of getting really lean is where those kind of diverge. But the body's going to be pretty resistant to putting on muscle if your health is relatively poor. So keeping the health relatively intact is a great way to put on muscle, right? So it's like, yeah, there's some overlap, but optimized training for putting on muscle does not look like a class, unfortunately, right? So it's like,
No,
you got to ask yourself what the goal is. If the goal is, I'm just trying to stay fit Sure, go for it. If the goal is, oh no, I'm trying to get jacked for the summer, we could probably come up with a strategy that's a little bit better.
Absolutely. And like you said, you get a lot of that health benefit from this stuff that's kind of might seem aimless to our eyes, who are really we're really focused on training. Like exercise is the thing we're training. We're obsessed with training. We love training. We're passionate about it. To other people who don't get it, there's like, well, I've been told that exercise is good and I know that, so I was like, I'm gonna do it. But that same
Yeah,
person could have, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's like,
I jog on the treadmill and I lift some weights. I don't write anything down. It's like, honestly, that's fine. It's like
yeah, in
like if
many
you don't
cases,
really
yeah,
care, yeah, if you don't care and you're just trying to get there to get generally healthy, you are going to be infinitely healthier than the
right.
person that doesn't do a bit of cardio and a bit of resistance training. Directionless stuff will get you pretty good health outcomes. Not optimal. We're leaving a bit on the table, but
Totally.
oh my, you are compared to a sedentary person, a bastion of health.
Yeah,
You're a god
you're a
walking this
beast.
earth. Like,
Absolutely, man. And I can tell you from experience, I've worked with a lot of people who spent time, whether it's months or years, going in and out of phases of their life where they do those fitness classes or they go to the gym. They move some weight, they move the stack. Oh, this one, here's the burn. I'll do my same 3 by 15, whatever. And sure, you can put on muscle and have some survivorship bias where you're like, oh yeah, I got more muscular. That's I did the right thing to get jacked. And this isn't even necessarily me like, you talk about like pretentious and holier than thou. I really try hard not to do that to people and be like, you're dumb. You trained like this for so long because you're dumb, and I'm smart, and I'm going to fix your training. Like it's more like, okay, here's why we're going to train. Here's why we're going to be consistent. Same movement, same quality of standard. We're going to minimize that. Not that you have to be too minimalistic to train properly, but we're not going to do everything, right? We kind of narrow in that
yeah,
focus. And then after months of training with me, if people are really happy with the results, without me pressuring them to say this by putting the words in their mouth, they'll say, I feel like I was doing it wrong for so long. And I'm glad that you showed me how to do this, whether it's
yeah, they
the
see the
movements,
difference in
executing
progression.
a huge progression, right? Newbie gains, hey, 3 months of classes actually is going to get you pretty jacked, or 6 months of,
Yeah,
just general work. But 6 months of training, oh my goodness, it's way more. It's way more
night and
gains.
day different. Yeah.
Night and day difference. So
Yeah,
nice.
what and Paris is dropping a video. I think it's supposed to come out today. I was talking to him yesterday about like the idea of like minimalism, right? And it's like minimalism is a great lens to look through. Not everybody should look through it, right? If you're someone who your bias is you notice that you're doing too little, or someone that objectively looks outside looking in, they're like, he should just do more. Like whether that's go harder or do more sets, you should do more. You probably aren't going to benefit from a minimalist lens, right? But if you're someone who's very passionate about lifting weights, you love thinking about it. Almost all of us try to do too much over and over and over and over. You got all these exercises. You're sold on these. This exercise has all of these unique benefits. This one has all these. I want all of them, right? And I'm going to do all of these things, a bunch of sets of each. And it's like minimalism for that lifter is a phenomenal lens to look through. It's like, what is really moving the ball here? Let me try to remove the things that aren't moving the ball, take the things that are, and do a really good job on the things I feel are actually moving the chains forward.
Well, and I've heard you talk about, like carryover and like these people who try and pick apart, like to reverse engineer a movement by not doing the movement and then putting it back together with these other movements. And to me, it's like, and then there's the people who are, maybe this even applies. I've done the same thing that you mentioned where you're neglecting vertical pressing. You add it in once a week. Oh, all of a sudden the shoulders stop hurting when you bench. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Where like you can have a spectrum of specificity, and on the other side, it's like carryover. And you want to find
Yeah.
a place for your movements, each person based on their goal and training history and whatever, all that good stuff. Navigate the spectrum of specificity to carryover, because you're going to need
Yeah.
some movement variety, but at the same time, you need to focus to really like get
Well, I think that's a
excellent at
great
something.
takeaway, right? It's like if your goal is something, you're not going to outthink specificity. You're
Yeah,
not going to be so clever that you come up with something that's going to get you better at bench pressing than bench pressing. Unfortunately,
true,
I've tried
true.
over and over and over for some reason. I've tried to come up with something that's going to work even better. As like this variation. Guess what? Doing that variation is the best way to get better at that variation. Now, as an adjunct on top of a good amount of specific training, but you're never going to beat specificity. I've tried to game the system so many times where I was like, oh, on my deadlifts, I'm going to do RDLs through my hypertrophy phase because I can handle more volume. Guess what? Doing deadlifts through my hypertrophy phase and deadlift, like in hypertrophy relevant rep ranges, outperformed it because I can't outthink specificity, you know? But at the same time, right, we also could always use this a little bit like after we do our specific training. you can always ask the really simple question of like big deadlifters, what muscles do they have that are big? And you come up with a couple muscles. I'm gonna do some bodybuilding for those muscles. That's probably a good idea. I'm gonna finish my specific deadlift training. I'm gonna do some rows. I'm gonna do some back extensions. I'm gonna do some hamstring curls, and that's gonna be a very helpful adjunct. Or I can find these variations that are going to help me get better at understanding the deadlift and have positional specific strength. If I always notice I'm losing the weight forward at my knee, I might do deadlifts with a pause at the knee because the goal is to highlight a technical element of that lift that I need to emphasize, or a strength element, either or. I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. But yeah, no, it's like I've always gone on the too far on the like my carryover side of that thing, where it's just I'm always like increase general physicality, increase general physicality. This exercise is good for general physicality. Then I'm gonna build up all the physical characteristics of a good deadlifter and do a bit of deadlifting, right? Where it's like you cannot outthink specificity, just being a concept of preparing for any physical endeavor. You're never going to outthink it. It's never going to work, right? But at the same time, you could be hyper specific in your training. And if you are a small, weak man and who's really good at squat, bench, deadlift, I have bad news for you. The big guy who's really not technical is going to torch you at a powerlifting contest because his general physicality is so far above. It's like you could say, "Oh, I got the most beautiful arch, my like scapular control. I'm drawing my sternum up. I got this beautiful bench press, and I just hit my first 2-plate bench press." Unfortunately, there's some guy who's just been spamming pec flies at like Gold's Gym who just threw up his first 315 in the same amount of time because he's just drinking like 8 protein shakes a day and doing drop sets. Unfortunately. So we need to strike a middle ground between the two of being really good at these tasks, using these tasks to build themselves up because we're not going to be able to outperform that, but also making sure that for periods of time our training is trying to level ourselves up as an entire unit, in addition to being better at powerlifting.
Well said, sir. Well said. Yeah. And I think a big problem with that too, like this is a good concept when executed, or I should say applied appropriately, the whole stimulus to fatigue ratio. I can see someone like yourself being like, okay, I want more hypertrophy / strength or just more development in my deadlift muscles. What can I do on top of my foundation of a well-managed, responsible, good technique deadlift program where you're planning out progressions and peaking and deloads and all that good stuff. So you're not replacing it. You're not trying to say deadlifts are suboptimal for development. You're saying, how can I do this without just like pulverizing my joints? If you did 315 Pete Rubish back extensions for reps, that's way less. People talk about central fatigue, nervous system. I try not to worry about that stuff too much. Maybe I will one day, but your joints.
Don't worry, you'll get there.
Yeah.
You'll get
I
there.
know, right? That's like further down the iceberg, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like I can do that.
I get
Pete
comments
Rubish.
on that.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I get comments on that where people say, "Well, man, your accessories look really light," and it's like that's because I'm intentionally seeking out the lightest stuff I feel will drive the like hypertrophy I'm looking for because I'm not trying to see. I'm never going to see at my level the back extension is not going to yield direct carryover. It's trying to build up physical attributes that then, when specific training is applied, my training goes a little bit smoother. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like I'm not trying to find the most heavy duty motion, right? Where it's like where you're at, it might be better to always bias towards the heavier duty option because you can manage the fatigue. And the heavier duty option is probably going to disrupt homeostasis more and it's going to drive more forward progression. And you're not at the point where you're not going to get direct carryover. You're going to see direct carryover. Your RDL is going to show up in your deadlift, your back extension, your row. All of these things are going to show up right in your deadlift. And it's like that was the part of training that I love the most because I'm a carryover guy. So I love spamming a bunch of other stuff and seeing it show up in my lift. But it's like now I'm at the level where it's like, no, the specific preparation, and then I've got to do these directed movements. But I get that. Paris actually even said that to me. It's like, man, your accessories look really light. And I was like, I have gone out of my way to try to set things up to where I can get difficult stimulative work. Because it's like because I squat and deadlift together always, which I know some people don't. That's my preference. That's just, to me, that's fundamental lower body training. It's the same thing a weightlifter does is you do some squats, pop the bar off your back, you do some pulls, right? Squats and hinges.
I always hear it that way. I never hear people do heavy deadlifts and then squat, especially if the bar's in their back. you know.
The way I've kind of explained it, right, is it's easier to deadlift with tired legs than it is to squat with a tired back. So
It's
practically,
terrible to
like
squat with a
part of that,
tired back. Worst thing ever.
I think would be like weightlifters, leg strength is more important than back strength proportionately, right? So you could say for weightlifters, that makes sense.
They
For
start
power
fresh.
lifters, the squat comes first in the contest, so it's more specific in some regard. But I do see guys instead of doing SBD days, they do DBS days, right? Because it's like if you really want
Oh,
to place
okay.
some priority on your deadlift and you're someone who heavily uses SBD days in your program, which I think
Mm.
is perfectly valid. The problem is deadlift is always inherently deprioritized by being the third motion of the day. So we can reverse the order of that. I know Jamal Browner, even though he probably doesn't need to do that, does that. I mean, he makes his money posting big gym lifts. So it makes sense to maximize the deadlift, not just try to maximize his powerlifting total. So I can respect that. But I do see that sometimes. But yeah, to me, that's kind of JF Caron like laid it out. He's just like year round, I'm doing squats and deadlifts together. Not because I like, even if they're not in the power, like the strongman show that I'm prepping for, these are just fundamental strength training movements that I feel safer doing my events when I'm strong at these, to be honest. So I do 2 to 3 days a week. Right now I'm squatting and deadlifting 3 days a week together. Um, and so after I do heavy squats and then I do heavy deadlifts, I can't then do like I could row probably about 4 plates to 455, right? I don't want to do that. I'm like, I'm not going to be able to recover if I do go pick the heaviest possible option. If I do super heavy Pete Rubish back extensions, super heavy barbell rows, and then like, I don't know what else I would do there, but some other stuff, and I pick the heaviest duty option, that
Mhm.
training session isn't going to let me turn around and repeat that effort 2 days later, right? So it's finding
Mm,
the upper echelons of what I can do at a somewhat frequent basis, right? I would say
yeah.
for a
It's
guy my
time
strength
sensitive.
level,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm very frequency oriented, I would say, compared to
Mm.
most people my strength level. I don't think most guys I can bench 3 days a week, I can squat 3 days a week, I can pull 3 days a week. There's some modification needed to the pulls to use some like self-limiting variations, but it's not like I've always been able to do that. Actually, when I was weaker, I couldn't do that. I built into it. Mostly because I feel like I am like a naturally explosive lifter, pretty like I don't know if it's like neural efficiency or fast twitch dominance, whatever you want to call it, but I always have been. And so like power production has never been as much of an issue as my technique, right? I think when guys are a little bit more explosive, they actually learn a little bit slower technically because they can't think while they lift. They're just going so fast. One of the guys I coach, his name is Mitch. He is like a mid 700-pound deadlifter. He's
Wow.
coming up on like a 500-pound bench press, and his squat is not very good, so we're not going to talk about that, right? And he is the most fast twitch dominant lifter. Like he's natural. He's just so super jacked and just is so explosive to the point where his ability to learn motor patterns is really poor because he can't think while he strains it because it's just flying up to 95, 100%. It's going fast. So he's got no ability to think while he strains. And Josh Bryant talks about this idea of hard gainers versus easy gainers, right? Hard gainers being people that aren't as neurally efficient, so they can't get as much out of their musculature with one set.
Mm.
You know, they're a little bit slower moving, so they have to do more sets, and that's how they
Mm.
get strong.
Mm.
Whereas you've got this idea of the easy gainer, like not the old easy hard gain muscle. He means it in terms of like strength gains. You have this
Oh,
other
okay.
guy who's very fast twitch. Yeah, he's got this theory about like slow gainers versus easy gainers, and the slow gainers are guys who are a little bit less fast twitch. They're a little bit less efficient with their nervous system. So Jeffrey Verity Schofield has to do a lot of sets, right? Because he's not able to maybe draw as much out in a single set. He has like the whole workhorse versus racehorse analogy. It's
See,
almost
I've
the
always
exact
been the
same.
racehorse. I think I'm like your other
Yeah,
guy, where it's like that first set, most productive, most stimulative, destroys me energy wise, and I'm just like very taxed. So if there's something else, I have to back off in some way,
yeah,
or I'm
yeah.
backing
Drop
off
the
the effort. Like
percentage.
totally, totally.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're
yeah.
either going to get way less reps, or you have to pull back the percentage. And that's exactly what we found, and that's the problem with him, right? So it's like you could use the racehorse, workhorse, or you could use the slow gainer, easy gainer. I use the slow gainer,
Sure.
easy gainer because Josh Bryant's been around saying that forever. And when you have this really neurally efficient guy who can get a ton out of his body, the upside is you don't have to do as much. He's able to tax his body that much because he's recruiting his motor units that much more efficiently. One set really takes it out of him, right? So it's like, oh, isn't that the best of both worlds? We have to do less work and we're getting stronger from it. Like this guy might be able to get stronger on 2 sets a week. Isn't that awesome? And the problem is you're stripping him of so many opportunities for technical practice that the workhorse type of guy gets. right?
Yeah.
The workhorse kind of guy did 10 sets. So he gets to practice, think about it, make some adjustments, go. So he gets to get a lot more technically proficient. And that's the problem that Mitch has run into is the amount of work that he needs to get better, or even the maximum amount of work he can handle is so low, he doesn't get very many feedback loops to get his form better. And so that's habitually the wall he's heading, like he's running into with his head is he is so strong in terms of contractile property, but so unskillful, you know? And so like we're
It's not
trying to build a
graceful. It's
program.
not graceful necessarily.
It's not at all. It's not at all. Like him lifting is wild. Like he just gets fired up, rips it. It looks pretty suspect a lot of the time. So we're trying to build a program around that that is going to help him because his weakest link in the chain isn't anything strength related. It's his technique, right? So then you start implementing like technical sessions, and I like using EMOM work for this, right? Where it's like 50 to 80%, right? Every minute on the minute. I find that's most often used for like compensatory acceleration training or for speed work. And I don't really care about it for those things. I find EMOM work to be one of the most helpful training styles for improving technique because you're never getting on your phone. You're standing, waiting for the next set with this feedback loop of that one felt a little bit off. What am I going to try different in 40 seconds to make this next one feel a little bit better? You try it. That felt good. Let me try to exaggerate that. The feedback loop is so rapid, and you can do anywhere from like 6 all the way out to 20 EMOM singles and get this huge amount of like, it doesn't have to be tremendously heavy. And we can trial and error a whole training cycle worth of like technique adjustments in a single session. So that's something we're implementing with Mitch is he's so powerful and gets so much out of his body and he like really tires himself out. His fatigue, his performance on the subsequent set falls off a cliff, right? Because he exerted so much, gets his adrenaline so high. So we got probably only 1 day a week does he need to squat and deadlift, but then we're going to have a second practice session using this EMOM work, which is my idea to give him an opportunity to work on that weakest link in the chain, which is his tech.
Very interesting. Well, I think you've just provided a very good challenge, and I would agree with it. You know, the subsequent set is an opportunity, maybe not to outwork yourself, but to work better than yourself, right? That's the quality. Like that is the justification for the second, third set. And, you know, people can argue over what kind of volume's good per session, right? And that obviously depends on your weekly frequency, that influences it. But someone like Mike Mentzer is going to say, if you can give me one good reason why you should do a second set, I'll let you. Like that's how he would like talk to his clients, Mike Mentzer. I think you just provided the perfect challenges. His one set was his opportunity to do it correctly and understand it, or he blew it. And I'm not
Practice.
sure if Mike Mentzer said, you know, one hard set per week, or if it was like one hard set per session with multiple sessions per week. I'm
I
not
think
sure.
it was per week.
I think it was per week. That's what I was thinking, but which is
Yeah.
like that's a very limited window of opportunity. Obviously, he's a bodybuilder, not into powerlifting,
Yeah.
but technique still matters for bodybuilding. It still matters a
Yeah.
lot, right?
Well,
So
I think
that
part of
you
it was
need that
Mike Mentzer was
opportunity.
big on like the Nautilus machines, right? So it's like you take away some of that skill curve. And
Interesting.
okay, you've taken away one of
Sure.
my
Yeah.
arguments there. There
Yeah.
isn't a
A leg
skill
a
curve for
leg
like a
extension, right, is not a squat. Yeah.
yeah, like a Nautilus preacher curl.
Yeah.
Okay, you got me. You've
Yeah.
trumped
Yeah. Yeah.
me. There is no skill curve there. You
Yeah.
got me. But yeah, it's like when we scale that over to powerlifting, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Dumbbells, barbells,
there are
calisthenics.
periods where we want to have more sets to improve our technique. Now, once a lifter is very advanced and they've got thousands of reps in their belt, you can see that volume get peeled back dramatically. Because they're strong enough that they don't need as many sets to disrupt homeostasis. So it's
Sure.
like I went to an Andrei Milanichev seminar a few years ago, and he says he's done one set of squats per week for the last like 10 years,
I
right?
believe it.
Well, when your
Believe
set of squats is 900 for 5, go home afterwards. You're
it.
right.
Go
What
home.
the hell? Yeah,
Ice
like do not
bath
do
and
anything
like
after that.
stretch your back. The chiropractor's going to put everything back into place.
Yeah, and so like people will say like, well, Andre does no accessories. Well, Andre started in bodybuilding, and there's a video of him being the most jacked human being I've ever seen, and then he started hyper specific training. It's just a perfect example of like what someone's doing now isn't what they did to get there. He had built a
Totally.
base of general musculature with a wider variety of movements. But yeah, you can see guys pull back on this volume because that guy Milanichev isn't going to learn like forget how to squat in a week. He's done
No.
this since he was a child. He's not going to forget how to squat in 1 week. He only needs to do
Yeah.
it once a week.
Yeah.
His warm-ups are enough practice. But an athlete below that level, yeah, we need to practice a little bit more often. Strength is a skill. And that's where I think the really stringent application of like extreme hit protocols to specific strength endeavors probably falls a little bit short. Is for most people, it might not even be enough work. But even for the ones for whom it is enough work, you probably need a little bit more technique practice than that, and you need to build your routine to accommodate. Like Mitch could do, like I really believe, like Mitch is a freak. Mitch could do like Mike Menser style, one set all out set of deadlifts, one all out set of squats, one all out set of bench press, one overhead press, one pull up, and then like
Go home.
that's it. And he could go like that could be his whole week of training. So it's like 5 sets. And
Yeah.
I really believe he could continue to get bigger and stronger, and he would continue to get less technical. And that's his biggest like area of falling short right now that we're trying to address.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And my challenge to it too was like, it's not that I disagree with Mike that, not a lot of work is needed to get a lot of benefit. And he says like it's like you're digging that hole deeper and it takes time for your body to fill it in. It's recovery, right? You need to actually come back from what you're doing. Otherwise, you're not realizing the full gains, and maybe you're shooting yourself in the foot by doing too much work. But at the same time, it's like for Mike to arbitrarily decide that one set is the cutoff
For
where you
everyone.
can, yeah, like you can just like that's the productive limit. Otherwise, you get negative consequences. Whereas you and I would say, no, it's probably more than one per movement, and it's certainly more than one per muscle to be
Yeah.
productive and not have like form breakdown,
Yeah.
absurd joint stress injury. It's more than one,
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah. Well, it's for sure more than one. I
It's
can't
for
even
sure
think of
more than one.
anyone for whom it's one. Even Mitch can
Yeah,
benefit from a second set. You know what I mean? Like even the guys who are on a bunch of steroids, they've got this huge lean body mass. They're moving a ton of weight for high reps. They can do a tremendous amount of damage to their body in a single set. Even they benefit from more than one. If we look at high performing, like the smart guys at the Mr. Olympia, right, who use this hit style, Ian Valier uses something like this. He does 2 sets per exercise and then like 4 or 5 exercises. That's so far from the Mike Menser protocol
yeah, it's
that I
very
don't
different.
even feel comfortable calling them the same thing. Because
Yeah,
I know that Bromley made a video critiquing hit, and he was critiquing like mostly like the Menser protocol, and Reddit did not like that, and they said, "Oh, you're straw manning hit. Why don't you ever talk about guys like James Hollingshead or Ian Valier?" And it's like fair enough. What they do, they call hit as well, but it's so far from the Mike Menser protocol that I don't think they're doing the same thing. So it's like as long as Bromley's critiquing the Mike Menser method, I think he's fully in the right.
in
Like
the
one
purest
set
form.
is just one
And
set.
if Mike were around
But
today and he saw their training, he'd have some words for them, right? Like he'd be trying to talk them out of it. He'd be trying to like
yeah,
change what they're doing.
he even said Dorian Yates does too much, right? Dorian Yates being like the ultimate poster boy of hit, but still far above the work per week suggested by Menser. The Menser stuff, I honestly feel comfortable just writing it off. I think it was a sales gimmick because it's like I don't even think that's what I don't really buy into that stuff, right? But like you
I
take it a
certainly
little bit further, a little bit more volume to like Yates level volume. And it's like, okay, well, we have to contextualize that to being that is a tremendously big, strong guy who's doing a lot more damage per set than the average trainee could, right? The average trainee is probably going to need to drive themselves away from homeostasis, accumulate a little bit more work than Dorian. I wouldn't say that. I would say that worked for Dorian, absolutely, right? And I think that similar approaches are currently working for many top bodybuilders. But then we extrapolate that downward to a normal sized person where once they can just get up off of one set of like one all out set of hack squats doesn't leave them dead. That's very different than watching Dorian do an all out set of hack squats. You might need to do a couple more to reach this requisite level of difficulty to drive forward progression. But the problem is that you can get into these goofy apples to oranges comparisons when we talk about hit because different people are talking about very very different protocols when
yeah,
that's
they've taken a lot
when they
of
say hit.
artistic license with what it means to do hit. Yeah, big time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't even blame them, right? Because just if you say who are the cornerstones of hit, you've got Dorian and you've got Mike Menser, and just those two alone are very fundamentally different approaches to training. One of them I don't think is too bad. One of them I think is pretty bad.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That is the case, and also with Mike too. And I think Natural Hypertrophy pointed this out pretty well in one or I don't know how many videos he made on Mike, but he had a pretty strong critique for Mike Menser as well. It's like Mike kind of it seems like Mike knew that that's not the upper limit of recoverable productive work done in a training session, and that is reflected in the nature of whether it's like beyond failure, forced reps, forced negatives, drop set, rest pause. It's like that's a big set, Mike. It's almost as if you're
Yeah,
trying to go beyond that,
get
like
extra.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
he knows that there's
It's a
more. I can
marketing
milk more
gimmick,
of it.
right? When
Yeah.
you can make something sound really neat and square and tidy, and then you say it with confidence, it's extremely marketable because people
He's
want
confident,
tidy
he's
answers.
smart, he articulated it well, and he's a good example of like like maybe not charismatic, but like a smart guy who can articulate his argument really well, but it just doesn't match up to reality. Sounds
Yeah,
great. And you yeah,
what I think what I think part of it is, right, is I think he understood better than his pitch, right? Like, okay, well, maybe the productive volume that needed to get better is lower than people think. And if you made a pitch and you came out there and you're like, hey guys, there's variability in response to training. Uh, that should be a prerequisite. There's variability in response to training, different recovery capabilities. But I do have a theory that you guys are doing too much. I think as little as this, but you're going to have to do some trial and error. When you say that, that is probably a lot more technically accurate of an answer,
it
but
is.
people don't gravitate to it because it's not a finite, this is a number, it's neat, it's tidy, because people like to think that the truth is a neat, tidy number. And I'm just trying to find the guy that tells me that number with the most confidence. And people tend to tune out when they start getting a little bit more nuanced, but actually correct answer. I don't I have to suspect it wasn't lost on him that people wanted a tidy answer because there's
I
no
think you're right.
way, like there's no way a guy that smart was like, there's nobody for whom it's two sets.
Yeah.
Nobody. Not
Or
one.
any exercise, no circumstances, like just
Yeah, like there's
okay.
no variability from muscle to
Yeah.
muscle in terms of recovery capability. Like
Movement
he
to movement.
understood that.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
guy, the guy that's smart that spent that much time in the gym was trying to make a marketable system. It's the same thing when like people make a diet, right? You want the diet to be nice and neat and tidy, but really good dieting is a set of principles that you need to write out in a book, right?
Yeah.
And people need to
Flexible
like
choices done consistently with a pattern, right?
exactly, but that doesn't sell as well
No, it
as just
doesn't.
saying the blank diet, right? The whatever, the cleanse or whatever the hell. If
Oh,
it's
sure.
neat and tidy and you say it with the same amount of confidence, there's a lot of people that are going to gravitate to that over the equally confident but nuanced answer because people are going to mistake nuance for a lack of confidence.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Well said.
I would say just I would look at your program, ask yourself why each motion is in there. If you hate emotion, you really need to start to learn to like it. You need to fall in love with emotion. It's worth doing. It's worth taking pride in your effort. It's worth taking pride in your execution. And once you take pride in something, you're going to start to dread it a little bit less. I was just talking to one of the guys I coach about split squats. If you hate split squats, you need to think long and hard about what these are doing for you and why they're making you better. And if you don't believe they are, we need to take a look at whether we should be doing them. But we're going to buy into the exercise. We're going to start really looking at our execution. We're going to start then applying really good intensity. And we're going to take pride and be like, yeah, I don't necessarily like them, but I do a damn good. Like, listen, you can critique me about this, you can critique me about this, but I do a damn good job of my split squats. And then you're going to start to like because it's like things people take pride in, they tend to like, right? And you should be able to look at everything in your program and know the reason going in because there's a relationship between willpower and why power. If you understand why you're doing an exercise, you're going to give a lot better effort consistently to that exercise. If you know this is going to make my future training cycles on the bench go better, you're going to dig a lot deeper than if you're just doing this because it's on the paper and you're supposed to, right? So it's worth everybody looking through, taking pride in your execution, and intensity, looking through your program, knowing why everything's in there. If you've got a coach and you don't get something, have a good discussion. If your coach gets mad at you for asking, fire them. They're a douche. Like that's my least favorite thing is like trust the process. Like at some point, when in a relationship with a client, you need to say trust the process. There are some people that are just going to ask and doubt and ask and doubt. No matter how many good answers you give, they're not bought in. And I'm like, okay, you need to take the leap here, and you need to just trust the process and believe it's going to work, right? Um, there's a time you're going to say that to a client, sure. But my biggest pet peeve is coaches that right off the bat, someone asks any question instead of giving a reasonable explanation for why they're doing it. They're just like, I know what I'm doing, bro. Trust the process. I've been doing this forever. And it's like, no, give an answer. Like, let them learn a little bit about why you're doing it because it very much comes off like you're either too lazy to explain it or you don't have a reason. And a lot of the time, it really comes off like you don't have a reason. And that's a bad sign. Maybe if you're the guy who asks his coach a bunch of questions constantly and maybe is disregarding the answers and he hits you with a just trust the process, don't read into that too much. Just trust the process. But if you feel like you never ask and you ask a reasonable question about what's this doing, or why am I feeling this way, or am I supposed to be fatigued, and they don't give you a good answer, you probably need to work on that as far as who is your coach.
I think so too. I think so too. Well, you heard it, folks. There's your take home message. Invest in your movements. Think about what's there. Be critical in that, and yeah, try and master those movements. Be passionate about it. You know. So that sounds like a lot of good common sense wisdom and tips. I think the audience probably got a lot out of your training history, the mistakes you made along the way, what you've done to refine the process. I think so many people could learn from you and what you're doing, and the amount of training footage you put out there and the explanation of it. You continually show that you are legit, like you are the legit lifter, wants to be a big strong dude, and I really respect that as someone else who aspires to be a big strong dude. I look up to you quite a bit, Sam. So thank you for joining today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Yeah,
It was fun.
folks, if you're looking for a coach, Sam is like, he comes extremely
Sam's full.
highly
Sam's
rated.
full.
Sam's full.
Sam's
Never
full.
mind. Never mind. Come back in 3 months. But at least go and subscribe to his YouTube channel, if nothing else. Yeah,
Please do.
awesome.